to this lecture that's sponsored by the Storer Endowment. And we're very fortunate today to have Ivette Perfecto from the University of Michigan as our speaker. Ivette got her bachelor's degree at the Universidad Sagrado Corazon in Puerto Rico, and then a master's and a PhD from Michigan in 1989. And then starting in 1989, she was started as an assistant professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, where she is currently the James E. Crowfoot Collegiate Professor of Environmental Justice. And Yvette's research spans ecology and issues of environmental justice, and she does this nice combination of basic ecology and applications that both towards sustainability and towards maintaining support for various groups. And in particular, she's done a lot of work on coffee, the coffee agroecosystem, which would make her popular with many people. And much of her research has taken place in Latin America, in Mexico, in Mesoamerica, and Puerto Rico, where she's from. She's the author of over 200 papers and the co-author of 4 books, including Coffee Agroecology and Ecological Complexity and Agroecology. And not surprisingly, she is the recipient of many honors, including Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, and just this past year was elected to membership in the National Academy of Sciences. And before I finish the introduction, I want to remind you that tomorrow she's giving a talk using natural history to understand the complexity of a tropical agroecosystem at 4:10 in 126 Wellman. That will also be available on Zoom again. And today she will be talking on food systems at a crossroad. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Perfecto.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. And those of you who are out there in Zoom, welcome. And thank you very much, Alan, for inviting me for this. It's an honor for me to be here today, especially for this lecture series. So the title of my talk is Food Systems at a Crossroad. I'm going to be talking more in general about why I think there's a need for a complete transformation of the food system and agriculture in particular. And I'm going to start with this quote by Rachel Carson. So she say, we stand now where 2 roads diverge. Actually, I think I'm going to have to use my glasses. We stand now where 2 roads diverge. But unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road that we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our last, our only chance to reach a destination that reassures the preservation of our earth. Those are the words of Rachel Carson. And we all know the consequences of the industrial food system and the industrial agricultural system, that easy highway that Rachel Carson talked about. But I think that it's important to emphasize that our food system is at the heart of many of the crises that we're confronting in the world today. So I'm going to do kind of an overview of those impacts. And one of the main victims, let's say, of industrial agriculture is biodiversity. I think many of you are aware of this. The world loss of insects, for example, is simply staggering. And we have some reports of more than 75% loss in insect biomass within protected areas. This is a study that came several years ago from Germany. According to a study of Rodolfo Dirso, just down the road here in Stanford University, of all the insects that the IUCN documented population trends, that have documented population trends, these are 203 species, 33% are in decline. There's some variability related to that, but there some of the orders, for example, the Orthoptera, which are the crickets and the grasshoppers, 100% of those populations show decline. And for the Coleoptera, the beetles, 60% of the populations have shown decline, are declining. And this is important, of course, because insects provide a lot of ecosystem services. They are pollinators, they're biological pest control agents, they're decomposers of organic matter, and they aerate the soil. So a lot of very important ecosystem functions that are performed by the insects, and we're losing them. But insects are also food for other organisms, like birds, for example. So after the insects are gone, the birds are also likely to disappear. And we're left with, like Rachel Carson say, her prophetic words, we're left with a silent spring. For example, studies from Europe show that birds in some regions of Europe have declined by a third. And in some other regions, in France, for example, there are reports of 2/3 of the birds declining. There is some evidence that the declines in bird populations are related to insects. Most of the birds that have been declining are insectivorous. And this is a study from North America that show basically that they've been documenting this decline in bird population for 50 years. We have lost approximately almost 3 billion birds and of insectivorous birds, birds that rely primarily on insects for their diet. The birds that don't use insect as frequently as their diet are actually doing okay. They're not declining. So that's a 111-fold difference between the insectivorous and the non-insectivorous birds. Now, this report was published about 2 years ago by Chatham House and the United Nations Environmental Program, authored by Tim Benton and colleagues. And they concluded this: our global food system is the primary driver of biodiversity loss, with agriculture alone being the identifier threat to 24,000 of the 28,000 species, that's 86%, that are at risk of extinction. The global rate of species extinction today is higher than the average rate over the past 10 million years. So this is really a biodiversity crisis. Now, I think it's important also to emphasize that there's a lot of evidence that is starting to accumulate that this biodiversity crisis or this biodiversity loss are primarily the result of the intensification of agriculture. Not necessarily agriculture per se, but the intensification of agriculture. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this paper by Ellis et al. That came out in 2021 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. It's a really, I encourage you to look at this paper. Basically, using some new technology, they did a very extensive study related to land use, global land use. And you can see here the classifications of the different land use system. And I want you to pay attention to this, the blue and the gray color. Those are the true wild lands. These are the areas that are not influenced by human beings. And it goes back to 8,000 or 12,000 years, where there's very little change in terms of the amount of wildland that is in the globe, terrestrial. We're talking about terrestrial ecosystems. So what's been changing is how we do agriculture and the intensity of that agriculture. And so they say even 12,000 years ago, nearly 3/4 of Earth land was inhabited and therefore shaped by human societies, including more than 95% of temperate and 90% of tropical woodlands. Lands now characterized as natural, what we today consider natural or intact and wild, generally exhibit long histories of use by human beings, as do protected areas and indigenous lands. And then they conclude their paper by saying The current biodiversity crisis can seldom be explained by the loss of uninhabited wildlands, resulting instead from the appropriation, colonization, and intensifying use of the biodiversity cultural landscapes, long shaped and sustained by prior societies. And they say that recognizing this deep cultural connection with biodiversity will therefore be essential to resolve the crisis. And I fully agree with their conclusion. Now, agriculture also is linked to problems related to water. Agriculture, of course, plays a major role in water pollution and is responsible for 70% of all water use globally. And then we have contamination, especially by synthetic fertilizer, although insecticide contamination is also a problem. So more than 50% of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is lost, adding excess reactive nitrogen to the surrounding environment. And there's what result of this kind of over fertilization that we have in agricultural areas are these anoxic zones, no? These are, or hypoxic zones. These are areas that are considered areas of eutrophication here in orange, and the red dots are hypoxic zones in red, and then there are a few recovery, actually quite a bit of recovery areas that are documented, and this is a sign of hope, no? This means that we can revert this trend if we have the will to do it, the political will to do it. And this is a biggie, no? This is a big one. The global food system is the single most contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Usually when we hear about climate change and people talk a lot about industry, about energy, which is also an important sector, but as a whole, the global food system contributes a third of the greenhouse gas emissions. This is a paper that was published not that long ago. And some people are actually estimating that if you consider the entire global food system, that it is between 30% and 50%. But I'm going on the conservative side here and saying that about a third of the, this is becoming fairly standard now. About a third of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the global food system, including, of course, agriculture. Then we have the health impacts. Now, this kind of, if you think about an insane global food system, is not only responsible for environmental degradation, as I've been describing, it's also implicated in human health degradation. This report that came out in 2017 from IPES called Food Health Nexus identified 5 channels through which the food system impact human health. And those are occupational health, environmental contamination, of course, consumption of contaminated and unsafe food, unhealthy dietary patterns, and food insecurity. All of these are ways in which our global food system, industrialized food system, affect the health of human beings. And of course, these environmental and health issues also impact the economy, no? Have economic impact. And this is a study that was published in 2018, where they estimated, this was the Food and Land Use Coalition, look at the data in terms of the cost, what we call the hidden cost of the agricultural and global food system. And this hidden cost is estimated to be almost $2 trillion in losses. If you compare that, basically they estimated the losses related to health, and you can see here the different components of that, of the blue area, which is the health, environment, including climate change, or greenhouse gas emissions, and then other economic factors like rural welfare, the loss of rural welfare, and etc. And if you add all of those, they come out to be $12 trillion, no? And this is yearly. And the estimated value market of the global food system is $10 trillion. So we're essentially losing, on a yearly basis, we're losing $2 trillion because of this industrial global food system. And the final point that I want to make, and not the least important, actually one of the most important one, are issues of justice related to the food system. Not only does our current food system degrades the environment, impacts the health of people and other organisms with whom we share our planet, and costs trillions of dollars, it is also an unjust system that strengthens inequalities and human suffering, both between countries and within countries. These inequalities occur at both of those scales. The burden of the unsustainable production, both in terms of environmental degradation and also the long-term socioeconomic well-being, falls disproportionately on the poor and on people of color. And without an intentional focus on equity, sustainability efforts can be hindered by inequalities. And even the World Bank has been making this claim, no, about the importance of equality. As food sovereignty advocate Maria Whitaker say, sustainability without justice is simply unsustainable injustice. Or, I'm sorry, sustaining injustice. So justice is also an essential part of the way that we need to transform the global food system. So I hope that with this brief introduction, that I have convinced you that we are in urgent need of transformation of the global food system. How can we break off this trajectory? How can we kind of diverge from, the easy highway that we've been taking to this other trajectory, this other road? And the reason I started this presentation with problems associated with the industrial food system was to highlight the fact that agriculture and food systems are not only about food production, no? But they are interlinked with many other factors: environmental, health, economic, social, cultural, etc. And therefore, the solutions have to be equally cost-cutting. And this is why I think one of the first points that I would like to make here is that we need to focus on multifunctional, multi-benefit agriculture. No? There has to be a focus away from just productivity, which has been for many years the focus, to these multifunctional and multi-benefit systems. Also, basically, we need to consider trade-offs across spatial and temporal scales and among all actors that are potentially impacted by the system, particularly the most marginalized producers and to some extent also consumers. And we don't want to shift the burden from one area to another area or from one generation to another generation. So we need to pay attention to these trade-offs. And finally, I think that it's important to put the small-scale farmers at the center of the global food system. And in the next part of my talk, I'm going to try to argue why I think that is important. So we're currently at a crossroad. We either don't do anything and continue along the easy road that is leading to disaster, as Rachel Carson pointed out many years ago, or we take a different road that will lead us to the transformation of the agricultural system and the global food system. So here I'm contrasting, just as a way to make a point, the industrial agricultural system with agroecological systems. One that relies mostly on monoculture, have low farm and landscape diversity, high external inputs, agrochemicals, GMOs, other technologies that are becoming more and more important in agriculture these days, large-scale farms, dominance of big corporations and long distribution chains. So it's not just the ecological aspect, but also political aspects. And then on the other side, agroecosystems or agroecological systems with high landscape and farm diversity, low external input, small-scale production, small and medium-scale production, and strong local distribution networks. Now, the bad news is that the intensive agricultural system continue to expand. The amount of land in these industrial crops that, like soybean, rapeseed, sugarcane, oil palm, these are crops that are produced primarily in these intensive systems, continue to increase. I couldn't find a graph for the latest, this goes only to 2011, but it has continued to increase, not at such a fast rate, but it has continued to increase. And so a lot of the land that is in agriculture is in these kinds of systems, and they continue to increase. The good news, on the other hand, is that agroecology and alternative food systems are being embraced by millions of farmers, especially in the global south, where a larger population or a larger proportion of the population is still directly connected to the land. So that's the good news, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. But I also want to mention that this is happening not only in the global south, but it's happening also in the global north. In Europe, for example, the European Commission embraced the concept of agroecology just recently, a few years ago, as a pathway to reduce negative impacts from agri-food systems on the environment. So in Europe, there's a lot of work that's being done, and this is kind of agroecology from the top down to some extent, no? Because it's coming with funding from the government and with directions from governments and the European Commission. And a recent evaluation work that was done and looking at whether this would be possible by Mayer that I cite here, concluded that agroecological measures from the plot to the food system level can indeed reduce environmental pressure while maintaining domestic food availability within the European Union. And I have to mention also that they say that that would be possible, but only if there's reduction in the food system size. So it's not just adopting these agroecological techniques, but there's some other stuff that we need to do to adjust so that we can actually do that. We can transform the global food system. In their case, in this particular study, they say that the food system that is based on should be based on the reduction, this transformation should be based on the reduction of animal production, food waste, and export production. So reducing the amount of export, that's going to be difficult because a lot of people are making, or some people are making a lot of money out of that, but that there has to be a little bit more focus on local and regional food systems. And then also the optimization of crop and livestock integration. Now, what is agroecology? So I've been talking about agroecology, but I really haven't defined agroecology. And some of you that are in this audience probably very familiar with this here, that agroecology has been defined as a practice, a science, and a movement. So when people talk about agroecology, they're not just talking about a science, the science of agroecology. They're talking about practices, and they're talking also about a movement. And I'll say something about each one of these. So the practice of agroecology, these are basically the practices that the farmers are adopting when they're either because they're traditional farmers and have been doing this for a long time, but also when they're converting to agroecological systems. Essential to agroecology is biodiversity, is the diversification of the system and the maintenance of biodiversity. Why? Because this basically what we have done with the Green Revolution and with the intensification of agriculture is substituting the functions that were done by biodiversity with agrochemicals, no, with external inputs. And we have to revert that, no? We have to start relying more on biological organisms to perform some of these functions. Soil conservation, water conservation, little or no external inputs. So the biodiversity basically works for biological control, pollination, etc. Recycling of materials, use nature as a guide. That's a very important component of the practice of agroecology. And I want to just mention that agroecology is not capital intensive like industrial agriculture. Is thought and knowledge intensive. And that's why the science of agroecology is very important as well. So the science of agroecology combined with the traditional knowledge that people have that have been transferred generation after generation is essential for this agroecological project. Also, I want to make the point that agroecology is not the same as organic agriculture. No, I've seen, well, you're living in California, you probably have seen organic production that looks like this. It's a little bit better than if they were applying, you know, tons of synthetic fertilizer and pesticides. So they apply biological pesticides and compost, et cetera, no? But it's still this monocultural intensive system that have, you know, other problems, environmental as well as social problems. Now, the science of agroecology, this is a very, very simple definition that I like by the Guard et al., 2003. Say that agroecology is the study of interactions between plants, animals, and humans, and the environment within agricultural systems. So very, very simple, very straightforward definition. Agroecology is inherently interdisciplinary. So I don't want to give the impression that agroecology is exclusively about ecology, but the way that people have defined agroecology, it incorporates many other sciences, including the social sciences, because humans are an essential component of the system, and you need to also understand the interaction among humans and between humans and their environment. And the science of agroecology is in constant, like I mentioned before, is in constant dialogue with traditional knowledge. So they feed from each other as well. A lot of the ideas that we get in the you know, people that do research in agroecology, we get them from the farmers. And you know, a lot of the farmers that are there paying attention to what's happening in nature, you know, they mention things that they see, that they think are happening, and we then do some research related to that and see, okay, let's go a little bit more in depth and see what's causing this, etc. So these are a bunch of books that, for those of you who are interested in agroecology, different perspectives and different aspects of the science of agroecology, including my book with John Vandermeer that focus on ecological complexity and agroecology. Now, I want to briefly, because you know I'm supposed to talk also about my research here, and I'm giving you a kind of a broader talk. I want to talk a little bit, at least touch on my own research. And I've been working, like Alan mentioned before, I've been working a lot in the coffee agroecosystem as a model system. It's a really interesting system because it has when it's produced, is cultivated with a lot of shade trees. I mean, first of all, it's cultivated along a gradient of different intensification. So you have monocultures of coffee with a lot of pesticides and all that, but you also have coffee farms that look like this, look like a forest, no? And have tons of biodiversity. And so we've been studying the complexity of this system that is very diverse and the ecological interactions that are going on in there. And I just want to give you a flavor of the type of agroecological research that I do related to the science of agroecology, no? So this is, some of you already know this story, but it's such a great story. I love telling this story. So this is an ant called Azteca sericiazur. It's an Azteca ant. And they tend hemipterans, like many ants do. They are arboreal. They nest on the shade trees. This is me here in the coffee farm. And then, you know, surrounded, basically the ants forage on the surrounding coffee plants that are surrounding the area where they're nesting. And they are tending these insects. The farmers, they see this, you know, they see these ants, they see the scale insects, they see plants that get completely covered by these scale insects, and they think that the ant is basically a pest because it's eating this scale insect that is an herbivore, and it grows really fast on the coffee plant when they are tended by the ants. So the farmers don't like the ant, beside the fact that it also bites and is a nuisance. You know, Ash know the story because he's been there, and so I'm sure that he's been bitten by the Azteca ant many times. So anyway, this is, as I mentioned before, the ant basically, oops, it looks like up here. Yeah, so they start foraging on the plants that are surrounding the nesting site, and they tend the scale insects in those areas. And here you can see a close-up of the ant. That's a little droplet of honeydew that's produced by the scale insect, and that's what the ant is, you know, is there, tending the scales to get that honeydew. In exchange for that, they protect the scale insects against their natural enemies. And the main natural enemy is this beetle called Asia orbigera. It's a coccinellid beetle. And it's a voracious beetle against this scale insect. This is the adult, and this is the larvae of the same beetle, the same species. And you notice that it's covered with all these waxy filaments, and there's a reason for that. You know, the waxy filaments essentially protect the beetle larvae against the action of the ants. So this is what is called a myrmecophilous beetle. That is a beetle that can live or like to live in areas with a lot of ants because the ants cannot do anything to them, but they are in an area that have tons of scale insects, no? Because the ants are tending the scales. So very high scale population, tons of scale insects, and they eat the scale insects, and the ants cannot do anything against them. And here you can see two ants kind of trying to attack the beetle. When they get in very high density, the ants try to attack the beetle, but they get all, you know, gummed up in the mandibles get filled with these waxy filaments, and they spend the next half an hour trying to clean their mandibles. And eventually they just ignore the beetles. And the beetles are free then to eat a lot of scale insects. You can see here the larvae eating the scales. Now, another thing that happens is that the larvae is protected against parasitoids. And this happens inadvertently or indirectly because the ants are protecting the scales against parasitoids, and they cannot distinguish between parasitoids that are attacking the scales and parasitoids that are attacking the beetle. And so they just scare away all the parasitoids that come close by, and therefore they protect the beetle. And so it results in a lower incidence of this parasitization. This is a wasp, a tiny wasp, an Eulophide that is emerging from these exit holes here from the pupae. So in the areas that have a lot of ants, there's a much lower parasitization rate of the beetle. The beetle basically is protected. Outside the areas, the clusters of the ants, they get attacked by the beetles. Now, the adult beetle doesn't have the same luck. You know, the adult beetle gets harassed constantly by the ants and sometimes killed, like what happened in this particular instance, that the ants managed to capture the beetle before it could fly away, and they kill it. And I love this slide because, you know, there's one ant there that is the ringleader that's giving the attack order. Of course, the ants don't do that, but it's a nice story. Okay, so here we have a very patchy environment. Some areas have the ants, very small areas have the ants. Most of the coffee plantation do not have the ants. In the areas with the ants, the larvae does really well, is protected from their natural enemies. It has a lot of food, so it develops really well. In the areas with the ant, the adult doesn't do very well. It gets harassed all the time. And then you have areas without the ants. And in those areas, which is the majority of the plantation, the majority of the farm, do not have the ants, because the ants, are very localized. So in those areas, it's not that great for the larvae, because they get attacked by parasitoids all the time, but it's really good for the adults. The adults are flying around, eating all the scales they can find, and essentially controlling the scale at the level of the entire farm. So here's a contradiction, from what the farmers see, which is this ant is problematic because it's basically tending all the scale insects, to what really happens, which is that those little clusters where the ant is and where you have a high population of the scale is a small percentage of the farm, and is the main refuge for the main biological control of the scale insect. So at the level of the entire farm, it's good to have those clusters. And so one of the things that we were, beside the natural history of this system, we're very interested in finding out how in the hell this beetle is able to go there, the adult, oviposit the females, go there, oviposit when there are all these ants around, and they can go there, oviposit, because the larvae are there, so and you can see them from the time that they're first instar, or second instar, really tiny, and they don't move that much. So how are they able to oviposit and also go there and eat scale insects, et cetera, et cetera? And we discovered the answer to the first question when we were looking under the microscope to some scale insects. These are scale insects, and we lifted one, and there it is, a beetle egg of the asaya. So the beetles are hiding their eggs under the scales. But how can they do that? I mean, it requires some time to lift the scale, oviposit, and then usually you find more than one egg. You find several eggs there. How are they able to do that? Well, it turns out, and yeah, this is the asaya egg. Turns out that there is a phorid parasitoid, another parasitoid, but this time it's a fly that attacks the ant. And so you have this phorid parasitoid. The pictures are not that great because it's really difficult to take pictures of that. But I made a little diagram here that you can see, where you can see that the ant is adopting kind of a weird position. Well, what they do, because the parasitoid doesn't have very good eyesight, what they do is that they get paralyzed when the phorids arrive. These are phorid parasitoids. And they get paralyzed, or they hide, or they go inside their nest. So the activity of the ants go way, way down when the phorids arrive. And that is a great opportunity for the beetle to actually go there and oviposit, eat some scales, and fly away. So that's what they do. And actually, we have done this is showing this graph here. This is a study by Stacy Philpott, and it shows the decline in the activity of the ants when the phorids are present. This is with phorids, the activity of the ant with phorids, and the activity of the ants without phorids. So the ants really reduce dramatically by about 50% their activity when the phorids are there. And in some cases, they basically paralyze. They become catatonic, and they just stay like that. They don't move at all, because the beetle needs needs the movement to be able to oviposit. And so what we have discovered also, and this is a study that was done by Shinji Sien, one of my PhD students, is that when the fly arrive and start attacking an ant that is moving, that ant releases a pheromone that tells the other ants, be careful, the phorids arrive, go back home or get paralyzed, do something, no? And it happens that the beetle actually has, basically is eavesdropping on the communication between the ants. The beetle is able to detect and respond to that pheromone. And we have done the experiments, you know, with the ants and the beetle. We have done experiments to show and demonstrate that the beetles actually have a reaction to the pheromone that the ants are releasing. And it's specifically the pheromone that say, be careful, the phorids arrive. You know, that particular pheromone attract the female beetles, not the males. The males can care less, actually. They don't respond at all. But the female beetles that are ready to oviposit, they respond to that. And then they go to the area, use that as an opportunity to oviposit under the scale insects, eat some scales, and fly away. And so what we have here is a series of tray-mediated, what we call tray-mediated cascades, no? So we have the ant basically having a positive effect here. The arrow is a positive effect on the scale, and then the beetle eating the scale, the beetle adult eating the scale, and the beetle larvae eating the scale. And then we have, these are all the direct interaction, phorids attacking or parasitizing the ants, no? But then you have tray-mediated interactions or higher order interactions, no? And that's when basically the ants changes the behavior, no? And interfere with the ability of the beetle to eat the scales, and also interfere with the ability of the beetle to oviposit on the plants, no? When the ant is active, they interfere with that ability. So that's a higher order interaction. And then you have an even higher order interaction, a second level order, higher order interaction with the phorids, because the phorids basically cancel the effect that the ants have. So the phorids interfere with the ability of the ants to interfere with the ability of the beetles to eat the scales and to oviposit, no? So these are higher order interactions that cascade down. And so when the farmers ask me what control pests in coffee agroecosystems, this is one story. We have stories like this for different pests by looking at these interactions between different organisms and the pests and diseases. And so when the farmers ask me what control pests in coffee agroecosystem, I tell them spatially explicit ecological complexity. Of course. Oh, that's very, you know, that's a joke, but to some extent is true. You know, you have all these very complex interactions that are going on in the agroecosystem, and that's what part of the science of agroecology is all about. And so when you have an agroecosystem like the coffee agroecosystem that is, you know, can be something like this, very diverse, or it can be something like this, which is a, you know, coffee monoculture. As you move down in the intensification gradient, the biodiversity is reduced dramatically. And when you lose biodiversity in this particular system where the Azteca ant, which is an arboreal ant, is like a keystone species in this complex series of interactions that affect the scale insect, the coffee rose, the leaf miner, the berry borer. I only talk about the scale insect as an example, but we have evidence for all of these. When you basically convert the system into a monoculture or intensify the system to something that looks like that, that is eventually going to eliminate that ant, which is a keystone species that influence or contribute, let's say, to the control of all these pests. And it can trigger then an outbreak of this pest in coffee. Now, how do you communicate that to farmers? Well, we have come up with a game. And when I say we, I'm talking primarily about Luis Garcia Barrios. Some of you might know Luis from Mexico. He's really a genius when it comes to games. He has developed several games. And he, we're friends and we talk a lot about our system and all that. And we decided, let's do a game on this and to be able to communicate these ideas to the farmers. Not specifically this, this is one example, but the idea of the complexity of nature, no? And so, so here, this is the game. It's called Azteca Chess. It's played between two people, and I can if you want, we can talk about that later on. But I showed you just some pictures of the workshops that we have with some of the farmers in Mexico, where we explain the system first with PowerPoint, the traditional way, and then we play the game. And then we're doing some evaluation. We did some evaluation of how much of the complexity of the systems the farmers actually understand after a presentation versus after playing the game. And there is a big difference between the two. And the game actually helped in them remembering these interactions, and they go back to their fields and they remember, the ant, and they remember the beetle. They, they start looking for the phorid fly and stuff like that. So it's actually been a very interesting project, and this is great. One day, this guy comes who is a farmer, a coffee farmer that participated in one of these workshops, and he's also a wood carver. And one day, like 3 weeks after we did a workshop in his community, he arrives in Ecosur, in Luis Garcia's office. He knocked on the office, and he was carrying this thing that he made from the pictures that we left there. We left a copy of the game, but it's like a cardboard, it's like, and he made these carvings that are beautiful. And so now we order him games, and so he's kind of making a little bit of money by selling the game. So anyway, that was just a side, like kind of a parenthesis to talk a little bit about my research, but also to give you kind of a highlight of what agroecology is all about, and one example of the type of agroecology that we're doing, and as a science, the science of agroecology. But then I mentioned that agroecology is a practice, is a science, and is a movement. And I think this is the most important part of agroecology, actually, because this is what's getting agroecology to be scaling out. Agroecology has been embraced by a lot of farmer organizations, small and medium scale farmer organizations. They're using this campesino a campesino methodology. This is farmer to farmer, basically farmer to farmer methodology. And there are a lot of examples, especially in Latin America, but not exclusively, of regions where a lot of farmers, I would say millions of farmers, are adopting agroecological practices. And one of them is MST, which is the biggest, MST is the landless movement in Brazil, the biggest social movement in Brazil. They are promoting agroecology. They have embraced agroecology and are promoting agroecology among the members of the MST. And we're talking here about hundreds of thousands of families that acquire land and are beginning to practicing agroecology. In Cuba, you probably know the example of Cuba that was, in a sense, forced to transform their agricultural system. Well, now that has become part and parcel of the agriculture in Cuba. And a lot of it has been spread through this farmer-to-farmer movement in Cuba. And then I don't know much about this, but I put it there because we're talking here about millions of farmers in India that are doing what is called zero-budget agriculture. They call it zero-budget agriculture, but in terms of the practices, is like agroecological practices, increasing diversity, not using external inputs, etc. So a lot of the small-scale farmers in some regions of India are adopting this, and it's really spreading through millions of farmers and farms in India. And then you have the agroecological schools, and this is also another mechanism that this is all from the ground up, okay? In Latin America and the global South, most of the agroecology that's happening is from the ground up. It's basically farmer-to-farmer movements and these agroecological schools that are campesino school or peasant farmer schools that are promoting agroecology. Now, how much time do I have, Alan? 0? Okay, so let me just say that a lot of farmers talk about, I mean, whenever I talk about agroecology, people always ask this question: Can small-scale farmers practicing agroecology feed the world? This is a very common question that emerged, and I would say that there's a lot of evidence that's accumulating that that is true. First of all, we already produce enough food to feed the world, and we still have almost 1 billion people going hungry in the world today. No? So it's not the amount of food that we're producing. That's not the problem. No? So why such a strong focus on small-scale farmers? Well, because in approximately 25% of the land they produce, and here I'm talking about the very small farmers, and this is a study that was published by Riccardi not that long ago. In approximately 25% of the land, they produce between 30 to 70% of the food that we eat globally. And this graph here shows basically is a big data set of about 40 plus countries. And on the left graph, you can see the percentage of total food produced by the various farms on different categories of size. So going from small farms to large farms, and here you can see, you know, that the highest is in the small scale farms. And then to the right, you have the amount of micronutrients. And so you can see here the macronutrients produced across the different farm size. And I need to put my glasses because I can't see here. But basically here you have carbohydrate, fats, and proteins. And then if you look at this graph from the same study, you see that these are for the different, you know, breaking down into different categories. You can see that basically for cereals, fruits, pulses, and root tubers, which is the majority of the food that we actually eat, the highest production is in the small farms. And the oil crops, of course, the large farms, and then the large farms also are big in other crops, like, you know, for animal feed and things like that. And this map here show the areas where the food is being produced, mostly in the global south by small-scale farmers, that many of them have these diverse farming systems, and then the feed and fuel production. So the proportions are even more striking in the United States, where you see that most of the area is being used to produce basically feed and fuel that feed very few people, mostly cars and animals, and we eat some of those animals and recover some of the calories, like is shown in this graph here, that essentially this is from the IPES food, that they have the total amount of calories that are produced, 4,600. What is lost in post-harvest, we lose a lot of food, between 30 to 50% of the food is lost. And so that's a big issue that we need to address. So post-harvest losses, 600 calories. Animal feed, 1,700 calories. We recover a little bit of that in the form of meat and dairy. But then we lose also some in distribution and household. And we're left with 2,002. Even after all those losses, we're left with 2,200 calories. And we still have 1 billion people going hungry. So again, it's not the amount of food that we're producing, but it's how we're producing that food. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll just mention this. I'm going to skip a few things about biodiversity and food production, but I'll just mention that the agroecological movement is also a political movement. It's actually a very political movement. It emerged as a reaction to the industrial food system and as a reaction to neoliberal globalization. That's how this agroecological movement emerged. And one of the pioneers of this agroecological movement is an organization called La Via Campesina, that is an umbrella organization of many farmer organizations throughout the world. So it basically is composed of millions of farmers. And it's part of the emancipatory politics of these people, no, of these groups and organization. And it's strongly linked to the concept of food sovereignty, a concept that was that emerged directly from La Via Campesina and the farmers. So this is a slide of La Via Campesina and their struggles for agroecology and for food sovereignty. And I'll just finish, with this slide. I have a few more slides, but I'll just finish by saying that we are indeed in a crossroad. And the world is moving very fast in these two different directions because we still have very strong industrial agriculture that keeps pushing and coming up with other technologies that are going to save the world, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, we have these kind of from the bottom up grassroots organizations that are working very hard to transform the agricultural system. And as I mentioned before, we're moving very fast in this direction, but I think there is a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope, actually, because I see a lot of transformation, even in the United States. I don't know how many of you know of the Agroecological Summit that's coming up in May. This is a group of people that got a grant from USDA, no other than USDA, to talk about agroecology and how agroecology can be placed in the food bill and the food policies in the United States. So there's a lot of movement now related to that. And with that, I'm going to just finish with this slide that I love, from a quote from Arundhati Roy. And it say, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I went a little bit over.
We have time for questions, and if you're going to ask a question, I ask that you use the mic so the audience on Zoom can hear it, and hold the mic this way so you speak into it, not this way where you don't hear it. You focused, as you said, very much on terrestrial food production. Have you thought at all, or if you want to make a brief comment about food production from the oceans and marine, and are similar things going on?
There are similar things going on, actually, with the industrial fisheries. And there is actually part of La Via Campesina is beginning to incorporate. There is like a parallel organization to La Via Campesina of fisher folks that are basically had been very much affected by the neoliberal policies and liberalization, and they are being affected by this industrial scale type of fisheries, and they're organizing as well. So I can't give you very specific examples, but I do know that there are parallel organizations to La Via Campesina that are dealing with fisher folks as well.
So any questions?
So thanks for that. But so you mentioned that you think that the world could feed the world in the small scale localized agriculture, but it seems like the workforce is distributed the wrong way. Like we have hundreds of farmers in the United States left now, and to do it this way, it would take hundreds of thousands of farm workers. And so I don't know if you have any comments on that and thinking about workforce distribution and what this movement is trying to do there.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we need to do a lot of work, as I mentioned before, to make this transition, no? Because it's not just the technology. We know how to do agroecological farming. We know how to do things in a more sustainable way. I mean, we can tweak around with it, and there's still a lot to be learned about the ecology of the system and all that. But we have enough knowledge to be able to do it, technically speaking. But there are a lot of issues and a lot of forces that prevent that from happening. And labor is one of them. You know, it is true that agroecological systems require more labor. And so how do you deal then with that? And also in terms of having more farmers, many more farmers. Now, we grew up during a period of time where the transition was toward industrialization, and people were going to the cities, and there were a lot of opportunities in the city and all that. Things have changed dramatically, no? People now are going away of the cities. There are a lot of problems in the cities, and there is like a renewed interest among the younger generation on agroecology. And so you see a lot of new farmers that are interested in agroecology. But having, we need to put we need to be able to facilitate that from happening, because, they need to acquire land. They need to be able to settle in the countryside in areas that are inciting for young people. So nobody wants to live out in the boonies where there's nothing going on, no? So it requires a whole transformation of rural areas, or, you don't necessarily have to talk about rural areas, but it can be like the periphery of the cities where most of the of food can be produced, in the areas surrounding the cities. But yeah, it does require a lot of other political, social, cultural changes.
So I'm going to read one question from Zoom and then maybe one more or two more from the room because it's getting late. The question from Zoom is, to better understand agroecological cropping systems, do you also study the functioning of the crop wild ancestors?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Do you study the crop wild ancestors in order to understand the wild ancestors of the crop in order to better understand the agroecological systems?
Yeah, well, that's part of the science of agroecology, and there are people that are definitely working on the genetics of this, the wild crops. Obviously, all of our crops come from wild plants originally that were domesticated. So that is an essential component. The conservation of biodiversity in general, is essential also for the sustainability of agriculture and moving forward, with the diversity, genetic diversity that is so important. So I don't work in that area, but it's definitely an area of research, and it's one of the important components actually of the movement of agroecology. A lot of these farmer organizations are very interested in preserving wild varieties and also the traditional varieties as well. So there's a strong focus on genetic diversity.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for coming. I had one question about your research in the coffee plantations.
Yeah.
I was wondering if any of the work that you've done has addressed the possibility of ecological side effects of increasing the beetle populations. So, like, for example, what if there's like another species that the beetle eats in addition to, or not eats, but causes the mortality of in addition to the scale insects?
Yeah, this beetle is very, I wouldn't say that is completely specialist on this particular scale. This scale is distributed, is the pantropical. It exists throughout the tropics and in several species of plants, not just coffee. But the beetle tend to be very specialist in hemipterans. And we have a look at what else they're doing. Their population never get extremely high. So I'm not concerned about they becoming, too abundant that might have an impact on another scale insect that is not a pest. Because they basically eat a lot of scales, and the things that are most abundant there is the ones that are pests, no? And so they focus on those that are very abundant. But it's a good thing to consider.
Lots of questions and not much time.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Yeah, sorry, I'll just do this. It seems like these land grant institutions are a huge part of why agriculture is the way it is. These land grant institutions, and they come out of a particular moment, 1862, of settler colonialism spreading from the East Coast to the West Coast. It comes out of the moment of the Homestead Act. Massive distribution of expropriated indigenous lands to white people, white settlers. We see today, land grant universities still doing the predominant research, spreading industrial agriculture across the United States to predominantly those same farmers. I'm wondering, is not only agriculture and food systems at a crossroad, but also land grant institutions, university agriculture in general? If so, how can it be more than just sustaining, the intensification and industrialization of plantations, of settler agriculture in the United States? How could it actually be a tool for agroecology and for food sovereignty?
That's a great question. Land grant institutions, all land grant institution, is Davis a grant land? Yeah. So you have a lot of agriculture here, and you have a lot of influence of big ag, I'm sure, like all the other land grants universities. But there are always a lot of people in the land grant universities that are doing alternative things. And I think that it's important to keep doing that and to keep pushing the boundaries. I think that with climate change, with the loss of biodiversity, it has become so evident that this system is failing us that I think there's an opening here for genuine transformation. Now, the problem is the interest of big ag and the power and the influence that big ag, and I'm including here food companies as well as the agrochemical companies and biotech companies, that they have enormous power, and it's very hard to fight against that. But I think that slowly we're making progress. Hopefully, I have a lot of hope for this conference that's coming up, the summit, the Agroecological Summit. Let's see if there is an opportunity there for influencing actually the Farm Bill, which will be huge if that happens. If agroecology is inserted in the Farm Bill, I think that could be huge.
Okay, with apologies, given the lateness of the hour, I think we should give
And
Ivette,
I apologize for going a little bit too far.
that's okay. Give Ivette a break. But before we thank her again, I want to remind people there's another seminar tomorrow, also again on Zoom, but in person at 126 Wellman at 4:10, and it will be related in the topics discussed, more focused on the particular ecological aspects, but very much related. So let's thank Ivette again for a wonderful seminar.
Thank you very much.